Brought to you by Penguin.
A Secret Garden, written by Katie Fforde and read by Helen Johns. The moral right of the author has been asserted. Chapter 1. Philly pulled at the gaffer tape with her teeth, failed to tear it, and groaned. "Hand me those secateurs, Grand," she said. Wind found its way up the sleeves of her coat, far colder than wind in April ought to be, in Philly's opinion. If it weren't for the primroses in the hedgerows, and the trays of forced bulbs in her greenhouse, it could have been February. Her grandfather shook his head. "You need scissors, or a knife. Here." He took out the Swiss Army knife he was never without, and cut the tape. Philly applied it to the rip in the polytunnel, and then looked carefully for more potential holes. "If we get the weather that's forecast, I need to be sure the wind can't get in." "Child, dear," said her grandfather, "a new polytunnel is what you need. Why won't you let me buy you one?" Philly, satisfied the tunnel was as windproof as it could be, handed him back his knife. "Grand, do we have to have this conversation every day? Wouldn't once a week be enough?" "Come on now. There's a storm brewing that might tear this old thing down. What would happen to your precious salvias then?" Philly nodded. "They might all be blown to bits, I realise that. But it's too late for a new polytunnel now." She smiled at him, knowing he couldn't win this argument. "But it's not too late for the next gale. You know they say April is the cruelest month. It could quite easily produce a hurricane for you." He was as stubborn as she was. She put her hand on his arm. "Grand, dear, I owe you enough already, and I don't want to get into more debt with you. I'll make do with this tunnel until I make enough money for a new one." Her grandfather tutted, but didn't argue any more. He wasn't giving up the battle, just retrenching. "Come away in and have some tea. There's cake." Philly brightened. "So what's wrong with it? Did you leave the walnuts out of a coffee and walnut?" "It's a trifle overbaked," he said. "Or burnt, as we said in the olden days." Philly was surprised. "What? Actual burnt? "Indeed, no. But it's not of merchantable quality." Philly laughed. "That's okay, then. But if you wouldn't mind hanging on, I need to do my posies and check which bulbs are advanced enough for me to bring to the stall. It won't take long. I've all my material picked and ready. Then it'll be time for the phone call. You remember they're all off to a party on Sunday, so they brought it forward. Could we have tea after that?" "Of course we could. I'll put the potatoes in for supper. The cake can be pudding." "Perfect." She kissed his cheek and took his arm as they set off. Philly headed for one of the outbuildings, her grandfather for the house. She was rather dreading the phone call. She had nothing new to tell her parents, nothing that would make them stop worrying, and therefore nagging for her to come home to Ireland, even if that meant leaving her grandfather here in England. She had no desire to abandon the adventure she and her grandfather had set out on 3 years ago, when her grandfather had happened to see a small holding online, and something about it appealed to him, although he'd been after a house with a few garages. She had gone with him to see it. When she'd seen it, she'd fallen in love with it too. It had a few acres, lots of outbuildings, and even a couple of old polytunnels. It was perfect for her to grow plants in, and see if her lifelong dream to be a plantswoman would withstand real-life experience. The house was a tumble-down money pit, no doubt about it. But Philly and her grandfather didn't mind living in the big old farmhouse kitchen and shutting off other rooms in winter. And what had completely sold it to her grandfather was the mouldering old...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?